What is going on, y'all? KMB here, your favorite top 69 Marvel Snapper, and we are here to talk about the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. There is only one place to start, and it is with Arishem, which is the baseline best deck in the format, in my humble opinion. However, there are a lot of differing decisions in terms of how people are building this deck, and you will have to make some choices that aren't necessarily the ones you want to make in order to make it fit into the metagame. This is the list that I have been using. It is an Arishem deck that is focused on spreading power across multiple locations and being able to surprise people on the final turn of the game thanks to your ability to redistribute power and your extremely powerful 5-drops in the form of Vision and Claw, which, after losing Leech and Dr. Octopus, are probably the best kind of 5-drops you have. This is what I would like to describe as something close to a fair Arishem list. It's as fair as Arishem can really get. You're not doing anything completely absurdly ridiculous in most of your games. You are playing things ahead of curve that are very good to play ahead of curve, but you are ultimately being a bit fair. There is, of course, one exception to this, and that is New Loki. New Loki is the best card in every Arishem deck by a significant margin. There are a lot of turn 2 snaps when you play a Loki. When you play against an Arishem deck and they snap you early, it almost always means they are going to Loki you. New Loki, extremely strong because it comes down earlier and mitigates one of the biggest weaknesses of this deck, which is Cassandra Nova. Now, don't get me wrong, Cassandra Nova is still going to be good into you. It's just going to be a little bit less good, and you are much more able to make up that gap with your opponent's cards than you would be with randomly generated ones. So, for those of you who are asking the fairly common question, is Loki now better in Arishem than old Loki was? I think relative to the rest of the deck, it is by far better, actually. It is the snap condition in this deck. The rest of what you have is contextual. You are almost always snapping Arishem Loki. However, I'm not exactly sure if the deck is on the whole better than it was before the nerfs to Doc Ock and Leech. I personally think that those were still very significant nerfs, as you can see by the fact that we aren't really running them. This is very close to a fair Arishem deck, and Loki is really the only thing lending it that massive unfairness. However, even a fair Arishem deck curving Claw into Doctor Doom on turn 4 and turn 5 is actually just very hard to beat. So, Arishem still a little bit too strong, still very beatable with Cassandra Nova, but has a new nut draw of turn 2 Loki. One thing that will surprise many people about this deck is the fact that there's not a Mockingbird in it. I think you are perfectly fine to put a Mockingbird in this deck and be like, KM, you idiot, you have no idea what you're talking about. Why aren't you playing Mockingbird in Arishem? The thing is, I have an 80% win rate with this build, and I can't bring myself to change something that's working that well. I totally understand the arguments, but I haven't missed her, and I don't really know what to say about it other than that. It is surprising to me, but that is where I'm at with this deck. Next up, let's talk about the other main metagame villain, and that is, of course, Sandman. My current preferred build of Sandman, and this goes back and forth between the Makkari build and a Patriot build. Right now, I am on the Patriot build. However, I think both of them are very reasonable. We'll talk about the other builds there in a bit. The upside of the Patriot build is that it is very good into mirrors and that you have Cassandra Nova and Absorbing Man against Arishem, which is otherwise a pretty bad matchup. I generally feel like this build is a little more equipped to deal with the things that are happening right now, where the Makkari build is a little more equipped to deal with the things that were happening about a week ago. This is the build that I like into other Sandmans and into Arishem. It's not necessarily the best build into everything, but into what I'm seeing a lot of, I think it's the one that makes the most sense. The other thing this deck does very well, especially against decks that are just like generally not going to put out a ton of points, is absolutely crush people with numbers. The other decks that happen to have Sandman in them are totally unable to bring to bear the points that this deck can bring to bear. For example, a Dazzler Patriot Blue Marvel Ultron is putting like 20 points in every lane. That's just strong. All of these decks benefit in a real way from having locations that are difficult to get onto, like Sanctum Sanctorum or Altar of Death, and they are extremely good at dealing with things that are unable to expect the Sandman. The one major downside of this deck is that it can be a little bit easy for your opponent to know you're a Sandman deck. once you play the Patriot, they kind of know, right? Like, nobody is actually playing non-Sandman Patriot right now. Once you start stacking that stuff in that lane, they know what's happening, they know you're Ultroning, and crucially, decks like Arishem can Alioth you, and that's another major problem. The reason I like this deck into Arishem is entirely down to Cassandra Nova and, of course, Absorbing Man on Cassandra Nova. You are not able to match them on points otherwise. When you look at this deck and then you look at the Arishem deck that we just played, it is very clear that on a normal draw, the Arishem deck will absolutely mollywop you, so you need to be doing something very unfair, like Cassandra Nova into Absorbing Man. Do note, Loki stuff, if they're turn 2 snapping you or turn 1 snapping you out of Arishem, it's a Loki, you lose to that. I would not stay on those matches. The classic MakkariMan is still perfectly serviceable. I would almost call this the default Sandman deck, the one that most people seem to be willing to play. I think that it has a legitimate, large amount of upside in that it is not finicky at all. There are no cards that you need to put together to get a combination of things to happen in this deck. It is literally just playing a good card into a good card, into a good card, into Sandman, into a good card. Very simple, very straightforward. If you are someone who enjoys just simply curving out, and the real decision is just, where do I put my guy on the final turn of the game? If you like if you like big decisions, if you like limited amounts of very impactful decisions, this is the deck for you. It reminds me of an aggro deck in other games where the real draw is that games have decision points that are very, very important, but there aren't too many. And there's a certain type of player that will like those high leverage decision situations. For those people, I definitely recommend MakkariMan. Final viable Sandman deck. One of the things that is very obvious about most Sandman decks is that they are Sandman decks, and that does necessarily impact their cube rates because when your opponent knows what you're snapping on, they can just get the hell out of there. And they do know what you're snapping on a good amount of the time. So let's talk about the most disguised Sandman you'll ever see with Marvel Boy and, of course, Squirrel Girl, the one true pairing to unite all of the archetypes. I've run into people who are leaning even further into this. I've seen someone just straight up playing Sandman in Zoo, which is just incredible. But the point I'm trying to make here is there are other decks that are better Sandman decks on paper, but the best Sandman deck is the deck your opponent doesn't know is a Sandman deck until it's too late. And there is a lot of value in that. Not so much that you want to always sacrifice a bunch of power, but if you have a side grade that keeps the deck a little bit more hidden, you might want to do that. Here is the Thena Move list that I've been playing, and frankly, this list is just underrated. It's just still solid into a bunch of stuff. Against Arishem, you have, of course, a Cassandra Nova and a Shang-Chi. I felt very good into Arishem decks basically all the time as long as I have Cassandra Nova and Shang-Chi. The worry you, of course, have is Loki. Their Lokis are quite good against you. They mitigate the impact of your Cassandra Nova. That's definitely a problem, but other than that, you're basically good to go. I have never felt unfavored in that matchup unless they're turn 2 Loki snapping me, and even then it's still kind of close, which is kind of bad because sometimes that means you're oh, I can handle this, and then you stay and then you can't handle this at all. But it is just a very strong, very good deck that does a lot of points in a very meaningful way. One thing you'll notice is that I've used the flex slot here on Magneto. You can use it on Vision, you can use it on Juggernaut. The lack of Juggernaut is mostly a testament to the fact that I am not a very big fan of the fact that Ultron is in the meta right now. Juggernaut is just, it's not great. There's a lot of Ultron running around, a lot of Zoo running around. Juggernaut's good when he's good, but not good when he's not good. And I think there's a lot more not good Juggernauts than there are good ones right now. I'm not particularly in love with Magneto. If you've got a better idea, feel free. Magneto was something that I put in here just to be okay, I'm not really sure what else I'm supposed to be doing. I know I don't like Juggernaut. I know I don't like Vision. Let's just play a guy that can randomly win me games if I play him on turn 5. And yeah, it turns out if you clog a lane with Magneto, you're probably going to win some games later on. And that is basically all he's here for. It's basically just he's my Hope Summers guy. He's there to do Hope Summers stuff and accelerate out and ruin Silver Surfers or whatever. That's kind of his job. Thena Hawk is also still around. I personally feel that it is roughly inferior to Thena Move, but it does have a little bit better of a matchup into being turn 2 Loki'd. It's not great, but it is a little bit better because there's more finicky stuff in here, whereas Thena Move is just mono good cards. It's just good cards on top of good cards on top of good cards. So after you get Loki'd, the discount is just completely insane for them. This card's a little bit more finicky. There's like a little bit more like conditional stuff. You need your rocks to get your Darkhawk bigger, things like that. There's a little bit of asymmetry in there. Again, a lot of stuff that makes sense here, a lot of stuff that, you know, it's iffy. One thing you'll notice that I'm not doing is playing the card Mystique. Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I just hate it. I hate it. I hate playing Mystique with Darkhawk. I hate it. It sucks. I'm not going to be a Ravonna deck. You can't make me be a Ravonna deck. I refuse. One thing you can also see is if you're missing, say, Nocturne, I think you can feel free to put in a Hope Summers, who is very good in an archetype like this. Now, you may notice that this deck does have Juggernaut and Cosmo in it, and it's because this deck really wants to go 3+3 on the final turn of the game, and those are the cards that are going to sort of solve the opposite problems from each other. For example, if someone is telegraphing a giant Ultron, well, you know who's going to solve that? Cosmo. Cosmo can solve that as long as you have priority. And so this deck ends up utilizing this stuff just a little bit better, in my opinion, because it's a little bit better at wanting to play a 5-drop on the 5th turn of the game. You just kind of be like, oh, here's a giant guy. Okay, I have priority. Now I have access to Juggernaut Cosmo. It plays well from ahead in a way that I don't necessarily think the Move deck does, which definitely mostly wants to be behind in order to properly leverage the tech. Zoo is still a deck and is still doing things. So this is sort of the generic point slam deck that just says, I'm going to put a bunch of points on the board. Are you going to be able to beat all the points that I'm putting on the board? Can you deal with what I'm doing? It has fairly poor matchups into the Clog-based decks. It has reasonably powerful matchups into things that are not really interacting with it in a meaningful way. This is a deck that's actually quite good into the Thena list we just talked about because it's just numbers. It's just going to do more numbers than them. And so there's almost a bit of a metagame cycle developing where I think I'd rather play the Thena decks into the Arishem decks, and I'd rather play the Zoo decks into the Thena decks. And then you start running into like, okay, well then there's stuff that beats Zoo decks, and then that Arishem stuff beats that stuff, and then you see where we're going with this, right? So Zoo's role in this metagame is to just do points, no interaction, big number, boom. That's the thing they do. That's exactly how you want to do it. You play out your cards, they get big buffs, you play your Gilgamesh, it's very large, you don't interact with anybody, you just count. It's kindergarten math. You're counting, you're doing addition. That's the deck. Speaking of math, this is definitely a pretty math-heavy deck in a way that is actually a little bit more problematic. This is, of course, a bounce list. There are a couple flex slots in here. For example, you could be running a Hit Monkey instead of the Sasquatch in here. It's kind of up to you the way you want to customize this deck, but I do think that Black Swan Bounce is a reasonable and powerful archetype, if only because it is very, very good into the Thena stuff and reasonably good into the rest of it. The issue is, of course, Sandman exists. You're gonna run into some Sandman issues, but hopefully you should never lose more than 2 cubes to them, or maybe 4 if you're aggressively snapping, but you should never be losing all that many cubes to a Sandman. And when you are playing against a deck that could conceivably be Sandman, you really do have to think about it hard. You have to be thinking, okay, can I play out all this stuff early? Am I willing to get all this stuff onto the board? That's part of what Sasquatch is doing here, because it is just a large dude that you can really set up situations that they can't really profitably Sandman you, but they think they can because they think you're stupid. And that kind of reversal of the snap is how you have to play those matchups. I don't necessarily have anything against Bounce right now. I don't think it's the best metagame for it, but I had some good wins with it. I also had plenty of bad losses with it. It's a fine, playable, and reasonable deck that outputs a lot of power at a very, very high sort of processing cost to your brain. You gotta think a lot when you play this deck, and that is genuinely hard. But because your output range is so varied, your opponents also have to think a lot, which at the very least offloads a bit of that sort of processing power to them. The other bounce deck you can play, the Ajax Bounce list, that of course has a ton of reasonable power into this metagame. I would describe this as sort of the very definition of a good deck. It might not be the best deck in the game, but it can do a lot of very strong things. However, it has competition in its space from the Ajax Dagger list, and I think most of the time when you see Ajax at this point, you should be expecting the other list and not this one. This is a strong, reasonable list, but we're in kind of a metagame where strong, reasonable isn't always the best place to be. However, this list is built very well to deal with Arishem, with Cassandra Nova, with Shang-Chi, and Ajax actually, people don't really get this about Ajax, but Ajax is a great card into Arishem because right now, none of them are running Rogue or Enchantress. They're all running Shang-Chi and Shadow King, and so he's always dodging that interaction, but also he's gigantic. Ajax is a great card into Arishem because he's just bigger than a blob most of the time when you do the thing that you want to do. So when I say this deck is built well into Arishem, I don't just mean it's a Cassandra Bounce deck. I mean, like, Ajax is actively a great card in that matchup. Speaking of Ajax being a great card in that matchup, I think this is the more common one now that the deck highlight with Yo Woody that we did on this list has gone out into the public. I think this is the Ajax list that I'm seeing more of. And I will note, you can make them even more similar by taking out Hobgoblin and replacing it with Beast, and then suddenly they're very close to the same deck. Like, it's very much doing almost the same thing, and I think that is an absolutely valid thing to do if you want to get Beast in here instead of Hobgoblin. Hobgoblin is probably the clunkiest and most awkward card in here. Beast is an extremely powerful card when you are doing as many strong dagger things as you are in a deck like this, but the core of this deck, the real thing that this deck is trying to accomplish is very straightforward. Ajax on 5, Ghost Spider Dagger on 6 alongside a Hazmat. Boom. You did it. That's your end game. Your end game can even include that Iron Fist, right? So you can be dropping, you know, the world's largest Hazmat Ajax. Again, this goes back to why Ajax is good into Arishem. It's just so damn big and nobody can interact with it. It's just like 22, 23, 24 power most of the time. Redonkulous. It's a really big guy. And because of that, you are then able to say, all right, well, Dagger's just going to win another one. That's if you haven't clogged them already, which you maybe have. Ajax and another threat, very powerful way to approach this current metagame. Silver Surfer remains mostly the same as the last time it was on this tier list. The one swap we've made is due to all of the Sandman. We are on Hope Summers instead of Sarah. Hope Summers allows you to have a solid line into Sandman decks by giving you the ability to play 2 3-drops on turn 5 as long as you accelerate with her one time. That ability to play 2 3-drops on turn 5 is a lot of how you are going to try to beat Sandman decks. It is maybe something of a lost cause, right? Like, they're still very good against you. You're still going to run into issues when they're playing Sandman stuff into you. Yes, but you are going to be more able to deal with it than you would if you were playing Sarah, and so Hope Summers is back in the list, as I think when I did that video, I was like, I wouldn't be surprised if long-term that ended up being correct. It's correct. It's correct. It's correct. We're back on Hope here. Silver is still the same deck you remember. It's just a little less well-positioned than you might think. I think a lot of people see a Zoo card like Marvel Boy come out, they're like, oh my god, Killmonger's amazing. All the Zoo decks are playing Kyera. It's actually better to be a Killmonger deck against, like, the weird Clog, Titania, and Hood lists. Like, those decks are actually, like, a lot worse into you. I've had Killmongers beat me when I was playing Bounce if I wasn't able to, like, properly throw priority, or if there was a Dark Dimension or something. Like, it's not exactly the Zoo beater you would expect it to be, and because of that, it's, like, you know, sort of iffy in terms of the other decks you have to play against in the metagame. There's less of a case for this deck being good than there was a week ago, I would say, but it is still a good, playable, functional deck in the game Marvel Snap. I gotta tell you, I played this list, I had very little success, but it is a deck people are playing, so I do need to put it on here and put a little bit of respect on my boy Goon Knight. Now, typically what this deck is trying to do is discard your hand if you can and get free stuff for doing it, whether that free stuff be a Proxima Midnight off of our Goon Knight or a Stature off of our Black Bolt. That's pretty much the idea here. I do think it might need a little more time in the oven. Like, I am compelled by what this deck does. I think it does things that are baseline pretty strong. But what I am struck by is, like, I don't know, can we play some stuff to make the curve a little easier? Are we able to be a Thena Angela deck? Are we able to be even just like a Hawkeye in here? I feel like would go a long way, just like having something good to start curving out with. Because a deck like this really wants to curve out. And if you're not drawing your early stuff, you end up in some really awkward situations. I think there's probably something here, but I think it maybe needs a little more time in the oven. You will run into people playing this. It is a reasonably strong disruptive deck. It's good, but I feel like there's something that could make it better. I just haven't landed on it myself. One of my friends has been doing quite well with a Sersi list recently, that of course being Big Baby. I think it can go multiple directions here. I still felt the same pain points as I did in previous metagames with this deck, where you're not exactly great at being a Mockingbird deck. You're almost good enough to be great at being a Mockingbird deck, but there's like these weird pain points that happen when you aren't Cerseiing. Annihilus, on the other hand, is quite strong in a metagame where people are really trying to actually clog you, whether that be from a variety of White Widows, or the Acid Arrow from Kate Bishop, or actually trying to clog you, like actually playing cards that clog you like goblins. There is a lot of clog in the metagame right now, and Annihilus is obviously completely insane into that. This is the kind of this is the kind of deck you play when you are just sick of losing to Clog. You are just like so sick of it, you hate it, you've been clogged too many times, get it out of here. Annihilus and Sersi have got your back if that's what you want. Speaking of Clog, you can still play the full Clog game plan. There are some, it's not bad. I'm not going to argue that it's actually bad. I think that, like, right now, I prefer playing the turn 6 Clog decks, like the Dagger one, but this is a tried and true way to win games of Marvel Snap. You put your opponents in a situation where they literally cannot win, and then that's a really good way to win the game, right? Well, the issue, of course, is one of, you run into, like, some cube equity issues a little bit, but I think, honestly, in my experience playing against this, I have forgotten about stuff that beats me enough that maybe you can just get away with it. Like, maybe that's just, like, self-snitching here, being like, yeah, I'm kind of an idiot, but it's actually really easy to just forget that you died to Cannonball now. It's actually just incredibly easy to be like, oh, wait, I'm dead to Cannonball Titania? Why did I stay in this game? It happens. It really does. And this deck still does a lot of what it used to. Obviously, it's fairly reliant on Magic. Magic, a very powerful thing right now. But there's honestly not as much, location removal as there otherwise would be. The nerf to Loki got rid of Snowguard as a major meta force. The addition of Copycat means that, like, Nocturne's spot is sometimes in trouble depending on what deck people are playing. It's a little bit, not necessarily easier to get Magic off, but, like, it's not the worst thing in the world to be a Magic deck right now. Namora is the same deck it always was, except because Arishem exists, you have to play Cassandra Nova now. Wow, major innovations happening here on the KM Best YouTube channel. Make sure you click subscribe for more innovations. The major case for Namora being a good deck right now is it beats the crap out of Sandman. It is just not a deck that Sandman can reasonably stand up to. You just do more points. You are a deck that only plays one card on the final few turns of the game anyway, so just light them up with a Wong combo, and they probably will go the way of the dodo. And that is the major case for Namora right now. You beat Sandman, you have Cassandra Nova. That's kind of it. No one's really playing Cosmo. The thing you really have to watch out for is being clogged. That is horrifying, scary, awful, and to quote Shaq, horror awful. This is one of the situations where I'm very, like, sort of torn when I play a deck like this, because it's like, okay, I need to get my stuff over to a lane so I can Namora it, but realistically, I also need to keep, like, a Nightcrawler or a Jeff in the lane with the Wong so I can actually, like, play cards, because there is so much Clog right now that you really do have to take it into account. Destroy is technically still a deck. I think it is a reasonable choice, but I think a lot of people sort of over-indexed for this. They saw Marvel Boy coming out. They were like, all right, I'm going to be the best Killmonger deck. And first of all, I don't even think Destroy is the best Killmonger deck. I think Silver Surfer is the best Killmonger deck. I think you can put Killmonger in Arishem. I think you can put Killmonger in the Thena deck. Those are all going to be better Killmonger decks than Destroy is. And I think that general issue is sort of the problem Destroy has most of the time, where it's just like, oh, okay, I'm like the 5th best thing at the reason to be me. That's just not a good thing. I really do feel like the meta is always in a good spot when Destroy is the best deck, and it has been a long time since that happened. I would love to see some love for a deck like this. I don't really know what it would be, but I do really want Destroy to get a little bit of help, because I am kind of sick of seeing it languish. We're literally in, like, we just left the Deadpool versus Wolverine season. We have a deck that plays Deadpool and Wolverine, and they're not even buffing it. And it's like, a lot of people like think like, oh, Second Dinner, they just buff stuff to, like, milk money or whatever. You can tell they don't do that because this deck still sucks. I actually think there's a far more coherent argument for discard over destroy right now. And it's not like the world's most coherent argument, but it's basically like, look, I'm better at points and I'm much harder to interact with. And because destroy is so vulnerable to all the interaction in the world, yeah, like it's a pretty straightforward thing, right? Like you kind of see where this is going, right? Like one of them is very vulnerable to interaction, one of them is not very vulnerable to interaction. They have similar amounts of points unless destroy is really nutting off, and then when destroy is really nutting off, you're not really getting a lot out of it. So this is a deck, a lot of the time it's going to come down to placement on turn 6. That's going to really matter. It's going to come down to, did you get something like that they're not expecting off of your helicarrier? Are you able to surprise them in some way? Because nobody expects surprises out of this deck. Most of what this is, though, is a numbers check. This deck is saying, are you tall enough to beat me in enough places for you to win the game against me? And, you know, that can or cannot be a relevant thing. One little play tip I have for you here, though, is you, against a deck like Sandman, have to really start considering if you want swarms in your hand on the final turn of the game. Because Sandman will prevent those Draculas from being realistically Apocalypse if you have 2 swarms stuck in your hand. You might want to get those out before. Keep that in mind when you are playing against Sandman decks. I know that can be hard to recognize, but it is something to pay attention to. If you got a Dracula down there, maybe you want to get that swarm out of your hand a little bit sooner. This is the Mr. Negative deck that my friend Butt has been playing. It is a Mr. Negative deck that is trying to even more ridiculously own you on turn 6. It does have some issues, right? Like there are ways to play around things like Sandman, but if you're snapping a negative Jane and you get Sandman, I think you kind of get what you deserve on that one. You have to be very cognizant of what your opponent is going to do to stop you from doing what you're doing. Whether that be Clog stuff, whether that be Sandman, a lot of that stuff can have major impacts on you. You do not have a magic in here. And you can play the other version, right? The other version has the ability to, like the classic sort of Mr. Negative deck, has the ability to play magic on turn 5, try to beat the Sandman stuff. That's real. You can do that too. As is, though, the fundamental premise of this deck is you're snapping your Mr. Negative Janes, and there's a deck in the metagame that makes it really stupid to do that. And so Mr. Negative has some really good things that it can do, especially as the Arishem decks are more fair. They don't have the interaction to keep up with you. So you can actually just beat the crap out of Arishem just by being like, what's up, dude? Here's 1,000,000 points of power on the final turn of the game. You can do that because they don't really have things like Sandman, Doc Ock is gone, Leech is gone. They can't do anything about you anymore. But Sandman coming back was bad news for this deck in a big way. Phoenix Force remains a powerful and competitive deck. It is, I think, somewhere in the range of one of the more okay decks to play right now. Either the best or second best combo deck, depending on how you feel about this, depending on how you feel about Mr. Negative, depending on how you feel about those weird Living Tribunal Onslaught decks, which I'm actually not putting on here because I think they're kind of a day one thing, but we'll see if I'm wrong about that. This is the same deck you remember it being. Of course, being a Shuri Nimrod deck is enough to take you over the top of many mid-range decks in the game. Being a powerful Phoenix Force deck is enough to take you over the top of many mid-range decks in the game, and that's kind of the raison d'etre of this entire deck. You want to be a deck that punishes mid-range decks. You can even get big enough to punish Arishem if you pull off your combo reasonably enough. You're also a deck that is absolutely dog water to Loki into. That hasn't changed. So a lot of Arishem gamers are snapping those turn 2 Lokis before they realize what you are. You can get some value out of that as well. All right, y'all, thank you so much for watching. I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. I, of course, will see you in the next one. Thank you so much, as always. Please remember to like and subscribe and leave a comment if you have something to say to me, unless it's mean. If it's mean, don't say it to me. Don't you dare. Don't you do it. Because I do read all of them. I will see your mean comment. I will probably delete it and hide it from the channel forever. And you will never know that you're hidden from the channel forever because it only shows up to me. So you'll just be leaving comments screaming in the void. If you'd like to scream in the void, be mean. If you'd like to not scream in the void, be nice. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one.